Hello. Today is April 21st, 2022. My name is Grace Canales, and I'm interviewing Sierra Hetherly for the South Texas Archives at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. This is a part of the Voices of a Pandemic Oral History Project in partnership with the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know, Ms. Sierra Hetherly, that this recorded interview will be placed in the South Texas Archives at Texas A&M University, Kingsville, and shared with the Voices Oral History Center at University of Texas at Austin. If there's anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, especially given that your recording may appear online, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there's something you do not want to talk about, please bring it up and we'll talk about it. Because we are not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting. So I'll ask a series of 6 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. There are 4 questions we need to make sure you agree to before we go on. South Texas Archives at Texas A&M University, Kingsville wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and other documentation at the South Texas Archives at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. We will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials you donate to the South Texas Archives at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. Do you give us consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Jurgen Library at Texas A&M University, Kingsville?
I agree.
Do you grant South Texas Archives at the Jurgen Library at Texas A&M University, Kingsville copyright over the interview and any material you provide?
I agree.
Do you agree to allow South Texas Archives at the Jurgen Library at Texas A&M University, Kingsville to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
I agree.
Do you grant South Texas Archives at the Jurgen Library at Texas A&M University, Kingsville consent to share your interview and your materials with the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin in inclusion of the Voices of the Pandemic Oral History Project, which may include posting the interview on the internet?
I agree.
We have many questions in a pre-interview form that we have already filled out. We use that information from the pre-interview form to help in research. The entire form is kept in a secure Voces server at the University of Texas at Austin. The final storing of the pre-interview form will be at the South Texas Archives at the Jurgen Library at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. We will have stripped out any contact information of yours or family members so that will not be a part of your public file. Your public file will only be accessible at the Jurgen Library. Do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview in your public file available to researchers at the South Texas Archives at the Jurgen Library at Texas A&M University, Kingsville?
I agree.
On occasion, Voces receives requests from journalists who wish to contact our interview subjects. We only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for us to share your phone numbers or emails with journalists?
I agree.
Okay, that concludes the pre. So, as mentioned, I am interviewing Sierra Hetherly. And Sierra, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you went to college, anything about yourself?
So I am a nurse in the ICU here in San Antonio. I went to college in North Carolina. I was living in North Carolina for a few years and went to school out there. Graduated in 2015 and started working at our local hospital there. I started off in a cardiac step-down unit taking care of up to 5 patients at a time. And then I moved into our cardiac ICU, where I was taking care of patients that had undergone open heart surgeries, valve replacements, any sort of lung surgeries as well. Um, and then I moved to San Antonio, where I've continued my career in the ICU.
Well, thank you. So let's get into these questions. Okay. So this one is going to be a broad topic. So tell me a little bit about your experience with COVID-19.
Um, so my experience is a little unique, I think. I was working at two different hospitals. Well, one at the start of the pandemic, when we really didn't know what was going on. We had started hearing about COVID, but not really taking care of any of these patients. Um, and the hospital that I was working at the time was actually the first hospital to get patients from the cruise ship that had come in. So I remember it being a pretty big deal. Reporters were at the hospital interviewing, I guess, some of the staff members. I wasn't there when the patient came in, but from what I heard, they had kind of, I guess, locked down the hospital in a way, rolled the patient in, and there were only select nurses that were responsible for caring for that patient. The CDC was there, other government officials were there, and it was a highly sensitive subject. The patient was in the back, and the nurses that would go in were watched as they put on their PPE, as they took it off. And I remember just thinking like, wow, this is a big deal, you know? But then at this point, we really didn't know what to expect. And I believe that patient did fairly well, and we're like, oh, okay, so is that it? And then we started seeing more and more patients over the summer. I know that we really didn't get too crazy, I guess, here when things were happening in New York. But a few months later, that's when we started seeing our surge. And the second hospital that I was at, I remember we had one unit that was strictly devoted to COVID patients. We had plastic tarps surrounding the rooms because we were supposed to be keeping them in airborne rooms, but we didn't have that many. So plastic tarps, HEPA filters all throughout the unit. So there was a constant hum. You couldn't hear what one another was saying. And I just remember these patients being very scared because they didn't know what to expect. And honestly, neither did we.
That sounds very, to experience everything and witnessing everything just happening. I bet that was a pretty scary moment for you. And I know you would probably think about the safety of your family, because I know you've mentioned to me that you have children at home. So, okay, let's continue. So how did you feel like when you would see families um let me see how I can phrase this. Seeing families not being able to see their loved ones because they have COVID. How did you feel?
So that one was difficult. I know that for me personally, I felt bad for family members that weren't able to be there with their loved ones and that weren't able to, know what was going on at all times, because these patients a lot of times weren't able to talk on the phone because either they had a mask on, they got very short of breath. Working in the ICU, a lot of them were intubated. So, of course, those patients weren't able to talk, and family members would call and we would give them updates. And it was just a constant, our phones were constantly ringing. And so we would step away, answer family members' questions, attempt to go back to work, and another family member would be calling, either about the same patient or a different patient. So as a healthcare professional, we would sympathize with them not being able to be there, but it was also frustrating to try to care for their loved ones because our phones were constantly ringing, and trying to explain that to family members without coming off as inconsiderate or like we didn't care. That was a challenge. Some family members understood, some would just ask, are they okay? Has anything changed? Okay, thank you, and hang up. And others would keep us on the phone for 20 minutes at a time, asking us everything that had happened throughout the day. And then they would call back the next hour, and we would have to say, look, like, if something happens, we will call you, because there were plenty of times when family members would call and then get frustrated because they were on hold and they were on hold, and they'd hang up and they'd call back and they'd be like, well, this is the fourth time I've called and I haven't spoken to anyone. And it wasn't that we were trying to ignore them, we were busy. So that was hard to explain. But definitely felt bad for some of them, because they would tell us, just take care of my dad, we're just really worried about him and we're all here praying for him. Take care of my mom, brothers, sisters, husband, wife. And we would just, promise to do the best we could, but we didn't ever know what the outcome would be.
Yeah, I can relate to that too so much. That really hit home for me. Okay, so do you remember your first ever COVID patient that you had to treat? Or the most memorable one?
So I do remember, going into work one day and they said, hey, you're on the COVID unit. And I know at that time there were several nurses who were refusing to go to the COVID unit. They were scared. Some of them were older nurses. Some of them had kids and didn't want to go. So some of them were immunocompromised on medications that would weaken their immune system. So, everyone had their reasons, but I went in and they said, this is your assignment. And I said, okay, like, this is what I'm here for. I don't exactly remember, what that patient's situation was or anything like that, but I would have to say that one of my most memorable patients, he he was sick at the time. He was on a high flow nasal cannula and a non-rebreather mask, which typically we use one therapy or the other, but with COVID, we were using both to try to keep the oxygen levels up, and prevent intubation of these patients. And so I remember kind of being frustrated with him throughout the night. The doctor was leaving for the night, and I had gotten a report that said, hey, if his oxygen level drops into the 80s, the doctor wants to know. And I said, like, 80s, 70s, like, what are we talking? What number is okay for this doctor? So the doctor was still on the unit, and I don't remember exactly what the oxygen level was, but I said, hey, where did you want it? And it was like 1 point below where he said was okay. And he was like, so what do we want to do for tonight? And he suggested that we have the patient lay on their belly, which is something that we found was helping them to oxygenate better. So to have this patient lay on his belly and kind of just go from there and call the on-call doctor if I needed to. I work during the night, so it's a little different because we're the only resources available, and we kind of just have to go with it, and call doctors as needed throughout the night. And so this patient, I had talked to him about it. He was agreeable. He said, okay. But a lot of times patients were uncomfortable on their bellies. And of course, they can't breathe and they're coughing, so they're panicking. So I had told him, just lay down. We're going to take care of you. He was agreeable. I walked out of the room, and walking in and out of these rooms was a big ordeal because we had to put on all of our PPE, take it off as we left the rooms. And so to go back in, it wasn't just a matter of walking into the room. It was a process. So I had left the room and then I noticed that his EKG monitor was off. I couldn't tell what he was doing in there. So I rushed back into the room as quickly as I can. And he's halfway out of the bed, tangled in lines, not oxygenating well. His mask is off. He's turning a different color. So got everything back on him first, get his oxygen on. And I just look this man in the eye and say, like, I know you're scared, but you need to do what I'm telling you to do, because if not, you're going to end up with a tube down your throat. I know you're uncomfortable, but that's going to be even more uncomfortable, you know? And he got it after that. I think he like heard the panic in my voice and he was scared. And he kind of just held my hand and he said like, okay, okay, like that's all he could say. And the rest of the night he did what I needed him to do. Um, but I was really worried for him because with how poorly he was doing, I could tell at some point he was probably going to require intubation. So I was off for a few days and I came back and I believe at that point he was intubated. And so I felt bad because I kind of figured that's what was going to happen. And then I had, spoken to his family, gotten to know them a little bit, so knew that they really loved and cared for him, of course. And then again, I think I was off for a few days and came back, and he was no longer there. He had passed away, and I I just felt, I don't know what it was about him and that connection that we had, but I felt pretty bad. I was like, oh no, not another one. Um, and yeah, I remember, I think his family had called back after that and just like, of course, thanked everyone for everything that they had done to take care of him. And um, but there are a few patients that I remember either, seeing them before intubation and then having them after, and then coming back and their bed not being there anymore.
I I truly believe like it's hard for you as a healthcare worker because like you said, you make these connections with these people and all of a sudden like they're there one day and then they're not. I bet it's really, really difficult. So, okay, so the next question is how has COVID impacted you and like generally like your children, your family, anybody?
Um, so COVID for me, of course, I have two children. They are now 5 and 10, so at that time 3 and 8. And so my son didn't go to school for what, probably almost a year. He was out of school doing school from home. My daughter, thankfully, her daycare remained open, so she was able to stay in daycare. And at the time, I was married, and my spouse was also a nurse. So we were both working as nurses during the pandemic. Um, I remember at one time he worked in the emergency department and I worked in the ICU. So we were seeing the sickest of the sick. And he had asked me, he said, should we send the kids somewhere else so that someone else can watch them while we take care of these patients in the hospital, because we don't know what's going to happen. Like, we don't want to bring it home to them. So that was a pretty difficult conversation for me because that's not something that I had ever thought about. And now here I was faced with this decision and I didn't know what the right thing to do was, because I didn't feel like it was right to take the kids away from both of us and to place that responsibility on, I first thought would have been my mom, but my mom's also a nurse, so she was taking care of COVID patients too. So then second thought was to my dad and my stepmom, but I just didn't feel like that would be appropriate. So we ended up keeping the children here at home. We both worked night shift, so we would alternate, who had them. And so we just went about it like that for a long time. And then at one point, my ex-husband went to go do a COVID contract. So he went to Abilene, where he was working 5 days a week as a ER nurse, because they were really needing help. So he left his job and went to go help them over there, which I feel put a lot of strain on our relationship. So ultimately ending in a divorce. But I feel like, I don't know that COVID, of course, was the cause, but I don't think it helped because it was a stressful time for the both of us. We weren't seeing each other. We didn't, communicate, and it was just overall challenging. For me personally, seeing the way that two different hospitals reacted to COVID was very interesting. One of them was super strict on everything. The other was a little less strict. And then just how they would react if nurses got sick. That was also an interesting. I luckily never got sick. But nurses that would get sick, it was, how long were they out for? Different hospitals had different policies. Were they out until they tested negative, until they had no symptoms? Like what? And I felt like rules changed every day, so it was hard to keep track. But otherwise, I feel like it probably affected my children more than anything.
Wow, that's that COVID not only changed everyone's lives, it definitely changed your life with your relationship and your children too. I bet they really felt impacted by it. Not only changed your home situation, but it also changed your work situation, and different, like you said, different rules changed. And wow, that is interesting. Okay, so how did COVID impact the ability to gather with your family and friends? Did it ever change? Did you have to do something different?
Yeah, so we, like I said, we kept the kids home for a really long time. Well, anyways, besides the one going to daycare and coming home, we really didn't communicate. Well, we would call family, but we never really met up until probably a few months after it had started. I know that my ex-husband did have a birthday during that time, but we were all nurses, so we did have a few people over because we're like, well, we're all around it anyways. And I think as nurses, we kind of just saw like how quickly things could change. So while we didn't want to expose other family members that had potentially not been exposed, to not hang around our nurse friends seemed a little ridiculous because we were all going through the same thing together. Maybe not the best advice, but we just felt like we needed a break too. I'm sure everyone did. And but as far as family, I know that there was a long time where I didn't see like my dad or my stepmom, my brothers, my sister. Kind of would talk to them here and there, but really just working. That was the main thing.
Well, before I continue on, thank you for doing the hardest work. I bet working in a hospital, not really able to see your family is very straining on a person, because I know it would be hard for me. So thank you, and to all the healthcare workers for doing what you do. And so let me continue. So this is gonna go to mostly your children. Questions about your children. You said that your son did remote to online. How was that? Was it difficult for him? Because you say you're a night shift nurse, and I bet you saw him going through what? How old is he? Like what? Eight?
He would have 8, 9 at the time. Yeah.
So how did you see him? How was he stressed out? I bet it was probably a lot for someone so young and not being able to interact with people. Can you give a little bit of insight on that?
Yes, so it was definitely a challenge. My son had I think at first when he had spring break, because that's when everything changed. He had spring break, and then they extended it by a week or two, and they said, maybe we'll return after this, and then 2 more weeks, and then indefinitely, Um, and when he started doing the online thing, at first of course, it was new to everybody, so there was a lot of working through the cracks and trying to get the students the education that they need, but also navigating doing it on the computer. Um, and I remember there being extreme frustration, and it was difficult too because one parent was usually asleep. So it was either that or both were asleep, depending on the situation. If one was coming off work and the other one had to go into work, we would do our best to stay awake until the other one could sleep. But sometimes both of us would be asleep and he would be doing school, and we would just say, wake us up if you need anything. But he was frustrated with doing it online and not being able to interact with friends as much. Um, and then just the schooling in general, of course, it's not the same thing as doing it in front of a teacher. Um, and I know at first they would kind of instruct the kids and then let them go to do their assignment, but then he would come to us asking questions and we have no idea what's going on. Um, so we would do our best to help him, and then he'd go back, and sometimes it was right, sometimes it was wrong, just depending on, he got the instruction, and it's hard to tell an 8-year-old, well, they told you what to do, like, how do you not know what to do? um but it was definitely a challenge. And then when school started back up the following year, we had to make the decision on whether or not to keep him home or to send him back. We did end up keeping him home until I believe it was their third quarter, so he didn't go back until the following February, only because we were still dealing with these patients. So while our daughter went to a small, daycare, we felt that it would be a little more risky for our son to go into a bigger environment with more kids. Um, and we didn't want to expose any other kids, especially not at, an elementary school. So we kept him home, and I I know that once he went back, he was definitely excited to go back and be around friends and not have to be on the computer as much anymore, and just to have an actual teacher in front of him.
Well, I that's interesting too, because when I was in high school, that was same thing. It was really difficult to either determine, like, even when you ask the teachers, they don't want to respond to your email or anything. So I'm glad my school wasn't the only school experiencing that. Okay, so how did the schools help your community during COVID-19? Did they disperse food? Did they provide, like, students, the laptops or Wi-Fi routers or anything like that?
So they did, I do know that there were quite a few, like food distributions that went on. Um, and it was like major community ones, as well as, just, lunches and breakfasts for the students. I believe it was at first just students, and then it was, like for siblings as well. If there were younger siblings in the household, then they would provide for them as well. Um, they did do the electronic devices, which was good because, we had a computer, but we had gotten like a separate desk for our son, and just his own little workspace. So it was good for him to be able to have a laptop there that the school had provided. I think that they did do the internet routers as well, but we had that taken care of for him. So the only thing that we had used was the laptop from the school.
Well, I'm glad your school board, wherever your son goes to school, actually gave them these supplies that they would essentially need because some families really don't have the money to provide. Okay, so let's talk about vaccinations. Are you vaccinated?
I am vaccinated. It did take me a little while to receive my vaccine, though. I know that they had first, come around to give it to all the healthcare professionals. And I know some nurses were skeptical about getting them, and I was one of them. Um, not not necessarily skeptical of getting vaccines. I'm all for vaccines. Just the fact that this one was so new and no one knew really what to expect. So it did take me a while to get on board and to get my vaccine. And it wasn't required at my job up until recently. I think they started mandating it. But since then, I have gotten both doses of my vaccine and my booster as well.
Okay, thanks for that insight. Okay, so we're going to talk about the healthcare. What kind of concerns or questions about healthcare have emerged as a result of COVID?
So I think, I think that as a result of COVID, a lot of I think it definitely impacted families the most. Like we had discussed earlier, just them, not being able to be around, and things are starting to get back to normal now, where families are allowed back in our units and allowed to stay overnight at times, and so things are finally starting to get back to that norm. But I think that it just brought up concerns about, nurses and equipment in the hospital. I remember, those daily beds and ventilator counts going out. Do we have enough supplies? Luckily, we really didn't ever have an issue with supplies, in the sense of like ventilators. We did have enough to go around. But things definitely changed as far as like monitoring. Some of our patients were on a monitor where we could see at the bedside. Others were on a monitor that was being seen across the hospital on a different floor, so they would have to call us if they saw something. And other patients were just on a bedside monitor that we didn't have, eyes on 24/7. So that was a little scary, as a nurse, not knowing exactly what your patient was doing unless you were right in front of their monitor. Um, I think it just brought along, concerns about safe patient ratios, because at times, typically an ICU nurse will take 1 to 2 patients. I think there was a time where I had 3 that were critically ill. All of them were intubated, all of them were on several medications. And I know at other places, some nurses were even taking up to 4 patients, which is most of the time unheard of in the ICU. So just concerns over that, concerns over wages for nurses, I think, was also a big discussion. We saw nurses leaving hospitals that needed them, in droves to join travel agencies where they were being paid 3 times as much as they were working at the bedside. So I know that brought along a lot of questions about, why are nurses leaving? Why won't they stay? And just in general, nurses, after working during the pandemic, saying, this isn't something I want to do anymore. I don't want to be a nurse. Like I I think a lot of people didn't expect something like this to ever happen in their lifetime, and then it did, and they said, this isn't something I want to do. I'm not interested in doing this. It's dangerous. And I guess frankly, I don't I don't get paid enough to do this, you know?
I was actually about to get to that question about, how did your hospital like react to all these nurses being let go? Because I know nurses are a very important part of the whole medical system. And what did your hospital do to, provide for y'all? Because you all work a lot of shifts and stuff. Did your shift schedule change?
Like I had mentioned earlier, I was at the beginning, I was working at two hospitals. One hospital, I saw a lot of nurses leave, and at the other hospital, if anything, I think maybe one or two left. So it wasn't a big change at the second facility, but at the first one, there were quite a few that had left. So the hospital was trying to incentivize those nurses that were still there, trying to get them to pick up an extra shift or two. So instead of working, normally we work 3 12-hour shifts a week. So instead of doing 3 shifts, if they could do a fourth or a fifth, and they would incentivize them by adding a little bonus to their paycheck, or increasing their rate, for the first shift. And then if they even did a second shift, they would get paid even more. So they kind of just tried to utilize the nurses that were still there. The other hospital that I worked at did the same thing, where they incentivized, nurses to pick up that fourth and fifth shift, but they also had help from the STRAC nurses, which is the San Antonio like region something or another. I don't know exactly what STRAC stands for, but those nurses came in, and they were travelers paid by the government, and they came in and they, helped us out quite a big deal. The first group that we got, we were in such desperate need for assistance that they had, I think, like a brief orientation during the day, but that was really just getting them put into the hospital system. And then the next time that they were assigned to work was supposed to be an orientation shift for them. They were supposed to be able to follow us around, get to know the charting system, get to know where things were kept. Those nurses came on and said, we don't have time for this. Just give us an assignment. Let us take care of patients. Let us help you. If we have questions, we'll ask. So that was really neat to see, because I don't know if I were thrown into a new environment and I didn't know what the charting system was, and I didn't know where, the supplies was kept, if I even had access to get into the computer, if I would have that sort of mentality. But some of these nurses had come from New York. So they already kind of just said, whatever it is you have for us, just give it to us and we'll do it. So that was neat.
I'm glad that they were just ready, like, okay, throw it at me. I'm glad. So, what advice do you have for future nurses or anyone who wants to become a part of the medical profession after experiencing this whole COVID situation?
I think the advice that I would offer, something that I saw throughout the pandemic with nurses that were brand new and with nurses that had been around for a lot longer, just to be flexible. Um, Nursing and healthcare in general is something that is constantly changing, whether it's for better or worse. Sometimes, especially with the COVID situation, at the beginning, we didn't know whether we were helping or harming patients with the treatments, because it was so brand new. Um, and one day we were told, okay, we're trying this is what we're going to do. And the next day we were hearing like, no, that's not necessarily helping anymore, so we're going to try this instead. So it's just a matter of being able to be flexible and to just know that things are going to change. It's not going to stay the same forever. and that if you truly want to be a nurse and like to help people, that's great. Just don't don't lose that spirit, because it does become challenging. It is difficult, and just stick it out and do the best that you can.
That's some very motivational words. Thank you. So those are all the questions I have on me, but is there anything else you'd like to share about your experiences with COVID-19 or your job in general?
Um, I think I'd just like to add that that as everyone knows, there was a lot of loss during COVID. At the hospital that I worked at, we did lose a couple of staff members to COVID as well. One worked as a unit secretary, and the other one worked as a lab technician. And those were I didn't know either person, but I did take care of both of them while they were patients in our hospital. Um, and I know that from my hometown, there was like a family that was basically annihilated by the virus. It took mom, dad, and I believe two sisters. So it was a tough time. It was frustrating for those that didn't believe what was going on, that were refusing to wear masks and didn't want to stay in or do what was necessary to help keep everyone safe. And during that time, I know that I had thought it, and I know several nurses were like, if it's not bad, then why don't these people come and help us? Why don't they volunteer their time and come see what it's like, because that might change their views. And I know a lot of people had said that, a lot of people had thought that. There was an inside little, like, I think it was a 10-minute video called Voices of the Pandemic, that was done, and some cameras were actually taken into units, and they were able to see what it was like. And I think that unless people were there, um, they won't really get to see what it was like. I know that my experience here was very different from the experience in New York. I wouldn't have wanted to see what that was like. Um, but overall, like, looking back now, it was an experience. And at the time being in it, it was just a matter of, okay, like, this is what we're doing and let's get through it. Um, and now looking back, I'm like, it wasn't normal. That was far from normal.
Well, thank you for sharing your experience, because you are right. What you experienced was not normal. And I'm very thankful to you for sharing it and basically telling the whole world, like, hey, this did happen. And hopefully it can also encourage people in the future, if this virus is still going on, to still be safe.
Yes,
So thank you so much, Sierra.
no problem.